Hello, and welcome to our inaugural Call to Action speaker series hosted by IEL's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I'm Vicki Adams, Deputy Director of the Institute for Energy Law, which is an institute of the Center for American and International Law. This is our first Call to Action speaker session. With these sessions, we hope to share actionable items for attendees to use in their own organizations to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's speaker is Regina Jones of Baker Hughes. She will be interviewed by Suzana Blades. Suzana Blades is Managing Counsel, Commercial Litigation and Arbitration in the Legal Department of ConocoPhillips in Houston. Suzana is also Vice Chair of IEL's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. I will now pass it to Suzana for further introduction of the series and today's speaker, Regina Jones.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. Thank you for joining. It is my pleasure today to welcome you all to this inaugural Call to Action speaker series hosted by, as Vicki said, the IEL DE&I committee. So a little bit of background on the committee. This committee started, about 3 years ago or so. And for the first 2 years, our goal was just to talk about DE&I and learn together. So one of the main activities we had was a book club. So the committee read together a series of books on diversity and inclusion topics. And it was very interesting. We shared a lot of knowledge, and I think everybody enjoyed. For the current term, if you guys are familiar with IEL, the way the committees work is that we have 2-year terms. For the current 2-year term, under the leadership of Murray Green from TotalEnergies, so I'm sure he's watching us today as well, we decided to be more proactive. So the goal now, instead of just talk about DE&I, we want to talk about taking action, actually. So what we are going to be doing for the next 2 years, in addition to many other activities that the committee is going to organize, is to host a speaker series. And no one better to start this today than Regina Jones, Chief Legal Counsel of Baker Hughes in Houston. And for all of you who know Regina and the ones that don't know Regina, Regina is an inspirational leader and a true champion for DE&I. So that's why we wanted to invite her today. And I'm sure you leave today this webinar having learned a lot about the great actions that Regina and Baker Hughes are taking in this DE&I space. So without further ado, I want to get started because you guys want to hear from Regina, not me. So let's get started. And some of you may have already listened to Regina's Flipping the Barrel podcast, which is fascinating. And her story is so interesting. We're not going to go through all of it today because, like I said, the goal today is to talk about actions, DE&I actions. But I do recommend, and you'll learn a lot more about Regina if you listen to the podcast. But let's just get to know a little bit about Regina if you don't know her yet. So Regina, do you mind telling us a little bit, where are you from? Where did you grow up? Why did you become a lawyer? Tell us very, very little bit about your story.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Suzana, and thank you, IEL, for not just inviting me to today's session, but also for really spending the time on such an important topic. I think action is imperative for us to really make progress, so I'm honored to have the chance to talk about some of the things that are really important, at least from my perspective, and at Baker Hughes as well. So about me, I try to say I'm from humble beginnings. I was born in the U.S. in Memphis, Tennessee, moved around a lot in the U.S. as a young girl. We lived in Texas, obviously, Oklahoma, Dallas, and New Orleans at different times. And then as an adult, my family lived abroad, where we lived in Paris, France for 5 years, as well as Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, just as part of our career mobility, if you will. So I have always wanted to be a lawyer. As a little girl, I started off wanting to be a Supreme Court justice, and that didn't quite work out. But I pivoted to then later wanting to be a prosecutor because of TV shows, and then went into a phase where now in positioning for my career in undergrad started to focus on criminal justice and criminology. And my dad asked me to take a different decision and move into a role where he thought things were progressing more aggressively, and so that I could effectively get off of the family payroll and on my own with a more sustainable income. So he recommended I go into technology as an undergrad degree. And so I actually ended up changing my major to information technology. Well, actually, no, I'm wrong. General business with a minor in computer science at the time, and began working in IT. I worked in IT for 10 years before I became a lawyer, went to law school at night. And it was during a time when companies actually offered the benefit of educational reimbursement, similar to the way you can have health insurance today. So my law school was paid for by two of my employers. First was El Paso Energy for the first half of my law school matriculation, and the second half was by Shell. So I ended up working in IT for 10 years, went to law school at night with the focus on law being my plan B. The bottom fell out of the tech bubble. I shifted then to begin to work in the legal profession and have been here ever since and loving every minute of it. So that's kind of my story.
Wonderful. One more thing, logistical comment I wanted to make is that we do want to, Regina welcomes any questions that you all in the audience may have for her. And we do hope that this will be an interactive conversation today. So as we start now to dive into the DE&I topics, we encourage each and all of you to post any questions that you have for Regina. We'll prioritize those. You can post on the Q&A box here. I'll read them to Regina, and the goal is that you all get a chance to, ask your questions to her. But okay, so let's then, now that we know a little bit about Regina, let's dive into DE&I now. So Regina, we know DE&I is very important to you, but tell us a little bit about your journey. Like, why is that important to you? What does it mean to you?
So, it's interesting because I found that as I have matured in my career as a younger person, DE&I was important because I was impacted by it, and because I felt there needed to be more room for equality, and because, quite frankly, it was a door opener so you could have access. So if companies were focused on ensuring that their workforce was diverse, then technically I would benefit from that and be able to have the same equal access that others would have to opportunity. And I always felt like if I got the opportunity, I'd be able to demonstrate that I actually could deliver and I was actually a great resource. As I've gotten more mature in my career, and I'll use that in place of the word older, I have found that it's more of a responsibility, because I have now benefited through my career because of others really taking a serious commitment to ensuring that I had the opportunity to grow and that I had the opportunity to develop. So now where I sit in a position where I actually can influence outcomes, I think it's a fundamental obligation and accountability that I have, not only to our workforce, but to our communities that we work within. And quite frankly, as a global citizen of the world, I want to see a workplace and a community and environment that looks not just like me, but where everyone shows up and they feel included as part of the conversation, and they're able to deliver all of the value that they bring to the table, and then we're able to work in a more cohesive, collaborative framework. So I think it's not just the right thing to do, it's the necessary thing to do as we continue to grow as an industry and as a profession.
That's why we invited you to start this speaker series, because of your passion to taking action. So can you please describe your role as Chief Legal Counsel at Baker Hughes, and in particular, what are you doing to help Baker Hughes advance its DE&I goals and initiatives?
So there's a lot. Look, first of all, just to kind of set the stage. So we have somewhere between 250 and 300 legal professionals in Baker Hughes, and we're spread across 31 countries. So very much a global organization. I report to the chairman and CEO, and I raise that because it's two hats that I need to wear. First is thinking about now the legal organization and the legal professionals on my team and in the countries that they represent and in the areas of the world where we operate. Secondly, as a member of the Baker Hughes executive leadership team, because I have accountability for the broader Baker Hughes workforce and also making sure that we're showing up internally and externally and living our values. We have 4 values: care, lead, grow, and collaborate. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is aligned with all 4 of those. So if we're able to really demonstrate our values and live them and breathe them to others, then we will automatically have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion across the board, full stop. Some of the things that we do. So as a leader, first of all, as a member of the leadership team, I have responsibility for actions, okay? And that's the focus of this call today. How do I demonstrate those? So each of the leaders that report to our CEO have a diversity action plan. And in those plans, it states now, based on the profile of your organization, now, what are the objectives that need to be taken to move the needle within your part of the organization? Secondly, what are the measurable results that you're focused on as part of that? Because the story and the expectations need to be based on the data within your respective team and within your respective part of the workforce. So with that said, what we've done in legal is something else that I think is fairly innovative in that we have a diversity council that's made up of about 30 members of the leadership team. So now you're talking, I'm sorry, not the leadership team, of the legal team. So you're talking about 10% of the organization within legal. The nice thing about this council is it is led from 100% by the individuals that are a member of the council. They tell me what we need to do as a function. And that's with an internal and external focus. There's 4 subcommittees on the council, and each of these subcommittees has its own action plan, and they take accountability for driving that. The first one is community. Their focus is finding opportunities for us to engage within the communities. Second is well-being, which is now the team's physical, mental health, and also driving a culture of inclusion. Third, there's the panel part of the council, which is focusing on how do we engage with our law firms in DE&I initiatives. And when I use the word engage, I really mean partner. I don't mean just put the hammer down on the firms and say, you got to do this or else. There is an element of making sure there's alignment, but it's more important that we try to work together with our firms as real partners. And then the fourth subcommittee is talent development, which is making sure we're finding learning opportunities for the team and also developing our talent so that once we are actually making commitments, they stay around and hang around with Baker Hughes. So we want to make sure we're nurturing our diverse lawyers, but also building a collaborative and inclusive environment across the organization. We also, working with our law firms that I mentioned, we have joint initiatives, and some of the things could be in the form of partnering and sharing and having joint opportunities around clerkships and interns. We also focus on how do we have diversity amongst our relationship partners, and how do we even partner on pro bono projects that may be driving community-focused efforts that are aligned with both the law firm's objectives as well as Baker Hughes' objectives. And there's other more unique, tailored things that we might do just based on the dynamics of the working relationship and the parts of the communities that we're in. Because if you remember, I mentioned that we have lawyers all over the world. So what we do around DEI in one part of the world may be distinctly different from actions that we may be taking in another part of the world or in US. Additionally, from a broader Baker Hughes executive leadership perspective, I am the executive leader for our women's network, ERG. So we have what are called employee resource groups. Now, specific groups that are targeted with membership that either identifies with a potential category or they are an ally associated with that group. So I'm the executive leader for the Women's Network. We also have a veterans, a Pride at Work, an abled, focused on workers with disabilities, multicultural, Black Employee Network, Asia Pacific American Forum, and also Latinx. So across the domains, each of these ERGs also has a role to play in now helping to frame more specific actions across the company based on some of their unique characteristics. There's also the supplier diversity emphasis that we have both within legal and across Baker Hughes. And that shows up, somewhat distinctly different in legal when we start talking about supplier diversity, because it's not just about the dollars that we're spending, but it's also recognizing that there's a few dimensions to diversity when you're talking about it in the legal profession. And then finally, I made this comment earlier, but making sure we're really digging into the data. And that's actually looking at what do our stats say, and not just at the very high level of what is your gender mix, but we look at every single thing we can, again, based on your part of the organization to say, okay, where might you have little nuances in the data that may provide meaningful insight into some of the actions that you need to focus. Like when we talk about equity, there's very distinct things that you can look at around equity to get a sense for whether or not you do have true equity across your organization, or whether there's areas, levels, roles, or specific categories of groups that we need to focus on. So it really is a collaborative framework, but it's something that we really try to lean into, making sure we're being thoughtful and innovative in our approach.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot. So Regina, we got a question from the audience, so I'll read that to you. So it comes from David Schwan. And the question is, how have you seen technology, particularly after 2020, provide new tools for people and managers to use to increase DE&I metrics in our industry? Given your IT background, that's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And I would say technology has done a lot of things. From just changing the way that we work, and even changing the parameters of now, when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to think about it at multiple layers, which is, okay, what are some of the challenges that, let's say, women who are working remotely may or may not have different from men? So I know that's not the core of your question, but I will just say the technology dynamic has changed a lot of fundamentals. So we can't make some traditional assumptions even when you're in the space. I think technology has given us the ability to really dig into nuances that we may not have had access to before. For instance, allowing and asking individuals in the company to self-identify when it comes to who now or what categories or characteristics they identify with. Because as you know, diversity is more than about just what you can see on the exterior, but trying to create an environment where employees self-identify and feel comfortable doing that allows us to now have more visibility to how diversity is showing up within Baker Hughes. That then allows us to be able to, in the background now, target some of our actions to make sure that we understand the real reflection or complexion of our workforce. Secondly, is when it comes to compensation and equity, because I talked about equity a moment ago. When you really start digging into now characteristics and levels of the company. So if I were to pick, again, females or women, and to say, okay, well, based on this part of the population now, based at varying levels of the company, what are the pay ranges by level, not just women versus men and the average compensation for all women versus the average compensation for all men. And if I use legal as an example, we actually did that, where we looked at what are our compensation ranges by level by gender as well as by specific cultural designations. And we actually found differences. And some of the differences, I'll be honest, were alarming even to me, because I thought I was doing a good job when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because when you look at the complexion of some of my team, you'll say, oh, okay, she's doing great. And look at me, I'm a diverse leader, so they've got to be doing good in legal. No, we weren't. We had some diversity at some levels, but then when you really start peeling back all the layers of the onion, and if you're open to doing that and you're transparent with yourself and humble, I had some issues with equity. And so we were actually able to implement some very specific actions. Now, when you're talking about just looking at a small group of individuals, which is female paralegals or African-American junior lawyers, where now you start doing things differently because you really are serious about equity. And there's a picture that we circulate in the company often when you're trying to define equity. And I'm sure you guys have probably seen it, but it's with the children that are looking over a fence to see I think it's a softball game or something. So just assume it's softball. And you have 3 children standing on 3 stools that are all the exact same height. But one is short and one is tall. So from an equality standpoint, they're all given the same tool, which is the same height of the bench. But only one of the children can see over the fence because that child happens to be taller than the other ones. So my point there is when we start talking about true equity, it's making sure that we're tailoring our actions to the specifics of the group that we're focused on. So some people may need a bench, but their bench may need to be structured a little differently than someone else's to ensure that they're able to now perform at the same level of others or have access to the same things as others. So it really is very much, and that's why I referenced the diversity action plans earlier as well, it's tailoring our actions to the exact needs and situation of the respective parts of the organization. So I hope that answers and then we have a diversity dashboard that leadership has access to now see across the board what does our diversity profile look like based on some of the characteristics and areas where we want to focus on as a company. And we look at that at the full ELT twice a month.
Thank you, Regina. That's a great answer. And, 2 things that you said that resonate with me is that how important it is to dive into the data, right? Not only rely on your impression, right? But really take a deep dive on the data. And also, I think often people get confused about inclusion and think that it's just about treating everybody the same way, about equality, right? And it's not. It's tailoring, right? The actions to specific needs. So thank you for that answer. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the business case for DE&I, right? I think by now you would think that everybody agrees that there is a business case for DE&I, but tell us about your view on that and how do you all, the leadership at Baker Hughes, sees it?
So I'll be honest with you, diversity is good business. And so leaning into DE&I, it's not just something that someone needs to do because it's the social issue of the day. Diversity is a differentiating factor, all right? And from where I sit, I'm resolute in the fact that it offers a competitive advantage. If you just use innovation, and you always want to ensure that in order to be innovative, that you have diversity of thought at the table, which means a diversity of experience, which also means a diversity of background. And that includes complexion and all the other dynamics that come along with diverse characteristics that we bring to the table. There are also studies that show that the most diverse companies are now more likely than ever to outperform their less diverse peers on profitability. There was a McKinsey study from May 2020, all right, on gender diversity. And it was interesting. The title of it, for anyone that may want to look it up, is called Diversity Wins, How Inclusion Matters. What was interesting about it is because it was a 5-year study of 1,000 firms where they looked at over from 2014 to 2019 now what their performance looks like based on their representation. And what they found was that the greater the representation, the higher the likelihood of outperformance. And in particular, companies that had more than, it was a gender-focused review or survey, but the companies with more, study, not survey, companies with more than 30% women executives were more likely to outperform companies with lower percentages. And then they went on to show that there was a 48% differential between the most gender diverse and the least gender diverse. So at the end of the day, homogeneity, from my perspective, it's a loss leader, if you will. Companies should never expect, and I say companies, but I include law firms in this, should never expect to be the best in class if they don't have access to the best in class. And to me, that means the best of everyone, not just the best of one particular element of the organization. So our ability to really now look at how can we really leverage our collective ability to move the needle, I think it's fundamentally critical. So why does DE&I matter? It matters for the things I talked about, as well as within Baker Hughes. And we have done some reviews, and unfortunately, I can't give now the specifics on the exact studies because I don't have those in front of me. But we reference the fact a lot that it has been shown that organizations with inclusive cultures are 2 times more likely to meet or exceed their financial targets. They're 3 times more likely to be high performing, and they're 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So if for no other reason, forget the fact that it's the right thing to do. If you really want to drive value for your stakeholders and for your shareholders and for the organizations collectively, you want to be diverse and you want to have access to the best talent that shows up to help accelerate the pace of making that happen. And diversity includes everyone. And I think it's important that we recognize that as well.
Thank you. Okay, let's now move on a little bit and talk about the energy industry. You have a lot of experience in the energy industry, knows that industry so well. So in your view, what is the current state of DE&I in the energy industry, and how does it compare with other industries?
So, it's interesting because I'm right now probably representing 2 industries, both of which you have a long way to go. One is legal and the other is energy, but I'll start with energy. So first of all, we have a long way to go, but we're moving in the right direction. We are putting energy, no pun intended, into making sure that our industry is more reflective of our communities and of the globe, quite frankly. And there is a recent study from the World Petroleum Council and Boston Consulting Group where they said that women make up 22% of the workforce in the oil and gas industry. However, that has been unchanged since 2017. Now, if that doesn't concern you, the second stat that came from that is female representation is lowest in oil field services, with only 4% women and 15% women in upstream exploration. So if you think about it, there's a long way to go there as well. And it's about making sure that we don't just put people in boxes, but we make sure that there is the right level of inclusiveness as part of this, the right equity, as well as some of the dynamics in the industry. We really have to work harder to make sure that we're serious about not just diversity, equity, and inclusion, but really moving the needle and making sure that we're seeing the impacts and we're able to retain, not just place people in roles. Corporate functions are doing a lot better in the industry. Corporate functions are typically where you'll find women in kind of business and administrative roles as opposed to the traditional STEM roles. However, irrespectively, we have a long way to go. One of the other things that came out of the survey is that generally gender diversity is one of our biggest challenges because we're in STEM fields. You typically see that there's not as many women that have gone into STEM type careers. And so as a result, we've really tried to lean into making sure we're early in the pipeline too, which is encouraging women and diverse talent of all characteristics to enter into the industry. And if we can get them in the industry, then the next level is making sure that we're cultivating careers and career paths, in addition to making sure we're reflective across our executive and executive management. So we've made a lot of progress, but there's still a very long way to go.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit about, attraction of diverse talent at the entry level, but tell us about the importance of diversity at the highest levels of the company. And at Baker Hughes, for example, how important it is to have diversity as part of the executive leadership team or part of the board to drive through diversity throughout the organization.
Mm-hmm. So, Suzana, that is a great question, but it's also one that I would hope for this group you wouldn't have to ask, because diversity within leadership is probably more important than having diversity within the ranks. Why do I say that? It's almost where I started, okay? If you have the ability to make change and influence change, it needs to be an accountability. And you need to utilize that to actually do it, okay? So for me, I don't know how you can really move the needle if you don't have diverse leadership, because I mentioned the sensitivity. You can't be sensitive to and drive the right culture around inclusiveness if you're not including people in the conversation that really do have the understanding and perspective as to what that means and what that looks like and how it feels. I mentioned the fact that Baker Hughes is a global company. All right. So we're in over 130 countries. And what diversity and inclusion and equity may look like in one part of the world versus another part of the world is completely different. So if we've got a team of people trying to figure that out that have never lived abroad, if I just pick that example, they're not going to get it right. We all know that. So diversity and leadership is a fundamental tenet to being successful. And it's serious commitment that it also demonstrates. If you're serious about it, you'll do something about it, and you'll have people in positions that reflect that commitment, as well as you'll have actions that they take to demonstrate, and where others can look across the organization and see that you actually mean and are acting upon what you say.
And how about diversity in boards? I mean, what role can a board play, to kind of force the leadership to really implement their DE&I goals?
Right. So the board can and should make sure they're holding management accountable for actually seeing that the actions that have been stated as priorities for the company are actually being acted upon in a meaningful way. Most companies now have commitments around diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what that looks like is very different based on the company. So the board has oversight for human capital as well as compensation. That includes DE&I. And in the space of ESG, environmental, social governance, there's just accountability for making sure that the commitments that are being made by companies actually have integrity. So the board plays a role in that. Employees play a role in that, and leadership plays a role in that. But it really is a hybrid type of relationship where everyone really has to come together and make sure that that momentum is there.
Great, thank you. All right, so you said you represent two industries, the energy industry and the legal profession. So let's talk about the legal profession now. And I wanted to kind of refer to an article that was recently published by Law 360. Mm-hmm. And the title of the article is "Diversity is Doomed Unless GCs Step Up." Mm-hmm. And Brian Ellis was the general counsel that was interviewed for that article. And then he says that in a recent conference about DE&I, he says DE&I is top of mind when he speaks with other Black legal chiefs, but in conversations with broader groups of general counsel, diversity typically isn't much of a focus. Do you agree with that? What's your experience with conversations with some of your peers, and any thoughts on that?
So I've read that article a couple of times, actually. I saw it when it came out. I actually sent an email to Sue Reisinger with Law 360 about it, because when I saw that, it made me sad, if I'm completely honest, because I felt like it was true. And why do I say that? Because when you look at diversity within our profession and the actions that really need to be taken to move the needle, one, I think it has to be collaborative and it has to be a partnership. Okay. But anyway, with that said, that article has, it was really frustrating because I recall it also had a reference to, and at least if it wasn't a specific reference, I left with the perspective of people at my level and in my role kind of burying their head in the sand, effectively saying, look, the law firms need to do what they need to do, and I can put down the hammer and say, I want to see this or else. All right. And that now is me living up to my commitment around diversity. All right. Because I told the law firms, this is what I want to see. And if they don't show up with that diversity, then I'm not going to do business with them. That's easy for me to say. All right. Quite frankly, it's easy for me to do as well, which is to set an arbitrary expectation, use that as my ability to say, okay, I set a goal and now I'm going to meet my objectives around supplier diversity. To really make a change in our industry requires a lot more than that. It requires that I understand now what some of the challenges are within the firms, and the firms understand what are some of the challenges within Baker Hughes, but also that collectively we really try to work together to figure out how do we change this. I don't know how to change the partner classes and the partner profiles of the senior leaders. It's in a law firm, at least from where I sit, it feels a lot more complex than it does in a corporate environment, first of all. Secondly, just the need to be accountable, even if it's not my people, meaning my corporate legal team I talked about, I got 300 lawyers, 31 countries. If I stop there, then I don't think I did diversity, equity, or inclusion justice. I've got to understand what is the entire portfolio of lives and roles that I have the ability to impact. And then I need to figure out how can I do it. So I'll use one example, and I have no idea if this person is on the call or not, but I think he's the best example of how he's come in and really tried to work with his law firms. And that is Ray Jeffrey with Koch Industries. And Ray was one of the first people that I talked to on just some of the things that they're doing in relation to partnering with law firms on the diversity topic. So that might be another person you can lean into on call to action. But Ray gave me insight into how Koch was really partnering as a team. And between the two of them, their collective efforts had more of an impact than each of the individual efforts on their own. So, I guess to summarize, I'll just say it's a team sport. It's not going to happen overnight. The energy industry isn't going to change overnight, and the legal profession isn't going to change overnight. But there are things that we can do to make change and affect change and position for the future so that we all win. So that, to me, I think needs to be the focus, is how can we win together? How can we be stronger together? And how can we really influence real change? But it requires sincerity, and it requires give and take as well. So I'll just kind of leave it at that, Suzanne, and there may be more questions or topic or comments on it. But I think the big takeaway is it has to be a partnership.
Yes, and can you tell us, I know you're very big into the power of influence and how it's important, in this dialogue and this D&I journey that all of us are going through, companies and law firms and all that, to have everybody play a role and have a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things. I think influence is important because in many instances, particularly in the legal profession, that's all we have is the ability to influence outcomes and change. All right. So, I mean, as the chief legal officer, I can change things as it relates to 300 people in the legal department, but I'm not going to change things as it relates to all of the other my peers unless I'm influencing them that this is something we need to do for the right reasons, not just because the law said it. And as part of that, I also think that it means everyone. And so I want to hone in on one thing, or one group of individuals, which is white males. Because one of the things I don't like is that I feel like in many instances when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it doesn't include them. And that's not right, because if we're really genuine about recognizing that we need to have innovation, we need to drive innovation, and we're trying to drive good outcomes, we have to recognize two things. One is diversity can't be exclusive. Okay, we can't exclude groups and populations from the conversation, first of all. And secondly, white males can even be diverse, because there are characteristics. If I talk about veterans, so that's one of the ERGs we have, or if I talk about enabled, which is one of individuals that might have certain disabilities. When I talk about LGBTQIA, it includes everyone. So I just have to make sure that when we think about diversity, we don't just think about it in the vein of complexions, because the influence that can come from now our collective actions, sometimes they're the most powerful in having those particular impacts. When I talked about my diversity council, the chair of our diversity council is a white male. The chair of our efforts with our strategic law firms is a white male. And it's not because I asked them to do it, it's because they're very strong allies in the legal department. And when you talk about now influence, when they're talking to their peers and their counterparts about why it's important, they actually can do it in a way that may be different from me. It doesn't come across now the same way. Anyone expects me, when you look at me, to think diversity is important. They don't always expect Finley on my team or John Keffer on my team to show up and now not want to do business with the firm unless they can actually see genuine, authentic emphasis around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the ability that we all have and the power that we all have to be able to influence outcomes, I could not underscore more. And we need to look at it as across every particular domain of diversity.
Thank you. We also have, the chair of this committee within IEL, Murray Green. He's a white male and he's the biggest champion for diversity. So I totally agree with what you said. And he's a force of nature, and he's going to move this conversation forward. So I'm sure he's listening. And just want to give a shout out to Murray, because he deserves it.
Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about, and you touch on this topic about recruiting diverse talent, right? Even with both within companies and law firms. But we all know that it's relatively easy to recruit a diverse talent, but the hard thing is to develop that person and to keep that person engaged and motivated to stay within the organization and then rise to the highest levels. So can you tell us about the journey that you see for diverse talents and how companies should invest energy in this?
Yes. So it's interesting because I was sitting in one of our ERG meetings not too long ago, and they were talking about how there had been an effort to place diverse talent in senior roles, okay? And how that also included giving diverse talent access to international roles, because international assignments within most global companies is an investment that you're making into oftentimes your executive leadership of the future. And one of the takeaways that I never anticipated was that even though these individuals were extremely grateful that they had these opportunities and were in these roles, they felt abandoned to a degree at some point. What do I mean? Because once they got into the role, then there was a perception that, okay, we gave them the opportunity and now they'll do well and they'll be able to perform. There's a concept that I refer to as scaffolding. which is really, we scaffold buildings. We're doing construction and we put scaffolding around them to hold them up because we don't want it to fall down. We were missing that when it came to now cultivating the careers and this pipeline of talent. So what would happen is that you might move individuals to these roles, you make a really big investment to get them there, and then they leave because now they don't have the internal support to ensure that they're being successful and also to ensure that their careers continue to progress. So we scaffold most people when we move them into roles, because a lot of times you have to recognize that everyone's not going to be 100% qualified for every job. But what we have to also recognize is sometimes we have to even do that in a differentiated way when we're talking about diverse talent. They may need access to communities, they may need access to other types of support because now we've kind of dropped them into the middle of the ocean, and we have to look at now what is the right thing that we need to do to make sure not only do they feel included and that there's equity, but also that we're investing in their long-term development and we're investing in their future so that we can retain that talent for the future. So we monitor not just what changes are we making at the recruitment level or at the promotion level, but also what does our retention look like for those individuals that we've continued to invest in, as well as for the broader workforce. What we also saw in some of our numbers in prior years is that as much as we were recruiting people, we were also seeing people leave the company. So we really weren't making any real headwinds because we weren't dealing with now attrition potential. And most of that attrition, or a lot of the attrition, was due to now lack of continued investment and development in those careers. And in the job markets that we're in, where it's extremely competitive and where there's emphasis across the board on making sure more diverse talent is in senior roles, what we also saw is that those individuals are being heavily recruited by others. So we have to not only recruit, we have to focus on retention, we have to focus on building up the pipeline of talent and giving them opportunities, but also recognizing that there may be uniqueness in the actions that need to be taken, not just doing one thing for everyone across the board and expecting or being surprised that they all don't have the same reaction.
Great, thank you for that. Let's now go back to law firms, and the ABA, American Bar Association. They have done a lot of work in trying to get more data on diversity, true diversity data from law firms, and they have asked legal departments to adopt their model survey and all of that, and actually demand, this data from their preferred provider firms. So tell us a little bit about this. You said that you believe your relationship with your law firm provider should be a partnership, but what type of data are you requesting that they provide you in your view on diversity within law firms and their business model and the need for change? So tell us about that.
So I think I have a mixed story on data. So I talked about data a lot earlier and how we use it, and it's a fundamental tenet around making sure you have clarity and visibility as to what actions need to be taken in your company or your law firm in this example. As a chief legal officer, I have examples of where others in my seat or others that are like head of litigation or head of M&A, some of the areas where you see increased legal spend, where they say, oh, before I engage any firm, we have to get their demographic data, or we have to look at they have to fill out a questionnaire, a diversity questionnaire. And I actually looked at this at one point as something to potentially institute, because it feels like you're doing something when you do that, okay? I don't ascribe to me asking a law firm, give me all of your data. Quite frankly, I'm not interested in running the business of a law firm, okay? If I was, I'd be a partner in a law firm. I'm interested in now influencing outcomes as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what that means is if you're doing something, it's going to be visible. No law firm has to give me all of their stats for me to be able to look at their partner class. Every partner class that comes out from any law firm, I look at it, all right? that's the evidence. Why do I need to see what the data is around their partners? They could have 99% non-diverse partners. But if you see in their partner classes, they're continuing to move the needle and they have a commitment to diversity, you can go on their website. Do they even have a section of the website related to diversity? If they don't, right there, to me, that's an indication that I don't want to work with that firm because I don't feel that our values are aligned. For me, it's more about value alignment. It's more about outcome-based actions. If I was held to that same standard where someone says, okay, if we're going to do Baker Hughes business, then we want to see your diversity stats, we're not going to be best in class. We're working. We recognize that we have areas we need to focus on, but you're absolutely going to see actions that line up with the areas that we're focusing. So we can't expect for Rome to be built in a day or for a firm's stats to line up with what the future needs to look like. So for me, I think it's all about now partnership and alignment and inclusiveness and working together where you have aligned cultures and values. I'm not a big, I want to see your stats type person. Now we did, when we did a RFP once, I think it was 2 years ago, we did ask for the data because it does allow you to be able to kind of do some comparative analysis, but it was just that it was for helping us with comparative analysis, but not for making the final decision. The final decisions were based on what we actually saw and what we actually heard when we were engaging with the law firms.
Great. So Regina, we do have one question that was posted here by Bashir Hassan. And the question is, what level of legal protection is afforded to DE&I in the US? And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit of, we don't want to get into the details of that, but like on a higher level from a GC perspective, right? How do you see the law evolving to either provide protection or not? We started seeing some lawsuits actually on the other side of diversity, right, and claiming discrimination, for too much, focus on DE&I. From a general counsel perspective, can you share your views on that, on how the law is evolving on this?
Yeah, I'll give you my perspective, and there's also probably plenty of other outside counsel on the call that could give a perspective as well. But, the law is evolving, and I think no one's immune from I'll just say a discrimination claim or a wrongful termination claim or any other claim because an individual employee or a group of employees either even doesn't believe that the actions the companies are taking are, quite frankly, doing right by them. From where I sit, there is an increasing expectation for publicly traded companies as well as by stakeholders, regardless of who your stakeholders are, to actually see evidence that you as an entity are focused on, I'll start with ESG, which I talked about, driving into the social elements that come along with that. That accountability now takes all different shapes and forms, whether it's holding you accountable in social media because you did or didn't do something, whether it's holding you accountable by now your investors, someone investing or not investing in you, or whether it's holding you accountable through some form of litigation. So right now, the law is developing more to expect more disclosure on what your actions and commitments are around diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, I also think there's two sides of that kind of sword, which is you need to do it right, and you still need to be held accountable for making sure that we're making the right decisions amongst the entirety of our workforce. So it depends on what legal jurisdiction you're talking about, as well as you have to make sure you're extremely cognizant and conscientious of things like data privacy. If you're talking about individuals in jurisdictions where data privacy rules apply, you also have to make sure you're cognizant of local jurisdictional rules in somewhere in the Middle East. For instance, when you're talking about LGBTQIA, and we're taking actions to make sure we're open and inclusive in the US, and you have employees working in the Middle East where certain things may be against their local laws. So balancing the local laws and the jurisdictions is an important part of anyone's actions, but that doesn't take away the accountability for having empathy and cultural sensitivity and demonstrating your values and commitments in your communities and your workforce. So we just have to figure that out, how to do it in compliance with the law, but that doesn't obviate us from the responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so to close this out, and thank you. Oh, we got one last question. Okay, so it's from TL Cabbage, and he says, you have spoken about companies and their outside counsel. What about the communities in which they do business? Careers in the oil industry often involve roles in regions or countries that may not be comfortable for people of various backgrounds and affinities, whether it be a rural region in the US or religiously homogeneous country abroad. What is your role in addressing the impact of such context on DE&I, I guess, in the communities in which Baker Hughes operates?
Okay. So that's a great question. And I think the short answer is we just have to figure it out. Okay. So how do you do that? One is we've got to be sensitive to the local culture and the local law, as I mentioned. It's including the right people at the table. If I use either the example that I was talking about, if I'm talking about LGBTQIA in the Middle East, all right, we have to comply with the law there. But within Baker Hughes, we're one citizenship. Okay. And so now we don't have less of an obligation, whether it's a country that doesn't allow women some of the same work characteristics or whatever, or work roles, you name it. I don't care. When you're in Baker Hughes, we treat everyone equally. And we are sensitive and we have empathy. I don't know if it means that we just need to do something differently. Like sometimes in the Middle East, if I stick to that example, maybe we aren't communicating things as vocally because that too could be non-compliant with their local laws, because now management is promoting something that's not legal in their country. Sometimes it could include even moving an employee if their life is at risk or their freedom is at risk because of their profile as a company. As an individual. What I would say is we just have to figure it out, but it requires that we have the right people in the conversation. Our ERGs have been very helpful in that. Sometimes actually sitting down and say, how do you recommend that we deal with this? We actually need some expert guidance here, meaning from someone who really understands the depth of the issue and is sensitive to it. So it just means I think we have the right people in the conversation, and we do it in a way where we're demonstrating empathy and care, and then where we also are sensitive to and absolutely compliant with the local law in the jurisdiction. And that is a delicate balance, but it's something that we have an obligation to be able to try to navigate. And as lawyers, that's kind of our day job. So we just have to help the business figure all of that out.
Thank you, Regina. All right, so I guess this concludes. We don't have any more questions from the audience, but I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us today, to be the first speaker in our speaker series, and sharing all this knowledge and all these actions with us. So we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzana, and thank you, IEL.
Regina and Suzana, thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. I especially loved the reminders that we need to give people the proper scaffolding, and diversity can't be exclusive.